We all know that in the War of the Last Alliance, Sauron took a broken sword to his finger and thus his physical form was destroyed. And we all know that after that, he got better. We all know that 3,019 years later, he was once again the Dark Lord of Mordor, until the One Ring was carried back up the slopes of Mount Doom, and there, due to a series of divine shenanigans, Sauron lost for the final time. But what happened in between? How did Sauron go from getting KO'd by Isildur at the end of the Second Age to Dark Lord of Mordor again at the end of the Third? How did the great enemy make the ultimate comeback, before then facing the ultimate defeat? This is the Third Age from Sauron's perspective. Maya, Govan and Melanine, and welcome to another episode of Tolkien Untangled. In this video, I'll be talking about the return of Sauron in the Third Age. But I guess we should really begin not at the start of that age, but at the end of the previous one. In the War of the Last Alliance, which marked the conclusion of the Second Age, Sauron got his ass kicked. After 7 years of hiding inside his dark tower, he finally emerged from Barad-dûr, and he engaged the two High Kings of his enemy's army in direct combat, High King Gil-galad and High King Elendil. Now, we know very little about the details of this 2-on-1 duel, except that surely it must have been epic. Side by side, Gil-galad and Elendil did battle with the Dark Lord on the slopes of Mount Doom, and there they vanquished him. But they gave their lives to do it. When the fight was over, Gil-galad was burned to death, Elendil was slain, and Sauron was beaten. And their climactic showdown was witnessed by Elendil's son, Isildur. So, as an act of execution, Isildur took up his father's broken sword, and he cut the One Ring from Sauron's finger, severing that connection between Sauron's spirit and his physical form. And after that, Sauron was vanquished for a time. He forsook his body, and his spirit fled far away and hid in waste places, and he took no visible shape again for many long years. Now, if you're interested in the mechanics of exactly how a spirit with no body is able to rebuild said body and take visible shape again, the good news is that Tolkien did go into quite a bit of detail on this, but the bad news, at least for this video, is that it's really quite academic and abstract. I think if I were to try and explain it fully right now, this wouldn't be a video about the rise of the Necromancer, it would be a 2-hour-long video about Middle-earth metaphysics. But there are a few basics that I should touch on, and the first thing to note is that the War of the Last Alliance was not the first time in the Second Age that Sauron got his body absolutely wrecked. 122 years before Isildur cut the ring from his finger, Sauron was caught up in the cataclysmic destruction of Númenor. His spirit survived the ruin wrought by Eru Ilúvatar, but his body did not even a little bit. And after his utter corporeal downfall, Sauron was robbed of his ability to choose a fair form ever again. Over the span of a century, he was able to construct a new physical form. He still had the One Ring, but he could no longer use it to deceive people into thinking he was anything other than obviously awful. He was stuck in an image of malice and hatred made visible. In an essay called Osunwe Kenta, which is published in The Nature of Middle-earth, we are told that evil things became wedded to the forms of their evil deeds, and if these bodies were taken from them or destroyed, they were nullified, until they had rebuilt a semblance of their former habitations, with which they could continue the evil courses in which they had become fixed. In another essay called On Spirit, which is also published in The Nature of Middle-earth, we get more information about how this works, but again, Tolkien uses very philosophical language that's not particularly easy to summarize in a YouTube video. So, to simplify this complex issue into something a little more internet-friendly, I guess, we can think of it like this. If God punches you in the face, you can expect to have an ugly black eye for quite some time. During the downfall of Númenor, Sauron tried going toe-to-toe with the supreme creator of all things, and he ended up limping away without a body. So, when his new form, his image of malice and hatred made visible, got taken down again, this time by Gil-galad and Elendil before the final strike was dealt by Isildur, Sauron took a long while to rebuild, longer than he had done after the downfall of Númenor. I suppose because each building up used up some of the inherent energy of the spirit, which might be called the will, or the effective link between the indestructible mind and the realization of its imagination. But to move back from metaphysics to Middle-earth history, it really did take Sauron a long time to regain any kind of physical form after the ring was cut from his finger. About 1,000 years, in fact. He disappeared into the far eastern wastes, and he was not seen again for roughly a millennium. However, contrary to what we see in Peter Jackson's films, after that millennium, Sauron totally did have a physical form again. He wasn't a big fiery eyeball, he was a shadowy figure with 4 fingers on his black hand. But just because Sauron didn't have a body for those 1,000 years does not mean he had no influence whatsoever. During the Second Age, Sauron exerted a great deal of control over the East and its Easterling inhabitants, and following his defeat in the War of the Last Alliance, the East was finally rid of him for a while. Unfortunately though, in the unfinished tales, we are told that the East did soon grow restless. Former servants and worshippers of Sauron were released now from his tyranny, but not from the evil and darkness that he had set in their hearts. Cruel wars raged among them, from which some were withdrawing westward, with minds filled with hatred. In the 490th year of the Third Age, Gondor was invaded by Easterlings for the very first time. We aren't explicitly told that Sauron was directly behind this, but either directly or indirectly, I think it's fair to suggest Sauron's recovering spirit had something to do with uniting the warring Easterlings and directing their hatred at Gondor. If he'd fled into the south instead of the east, I imagine it would be an army of Southrons who would have broken the peace of the early Third Age. Now, as it goes, this Easterling invasion was nowhere near the Third Age's most significant Easterling invasion, and 10 years later they were defeated and driven back by the 8th king of Gondor, a guy called Tarostar. But it marks the beginning of a trend that we're going to see over and over and over throughout the Third Age. And this trend is bound up with a really interesting question. What exactly does Sauron want? Well, I think in the Third Age there are 3 potential answers to that question. Firstly, rings of power. Sauron still possesses the 9 rings that were gifted to the race of men, but he's missing at least 1 of the 7, all of the 3, and most importantly, the one ring that rules them all. If he can reclaim it, his defeat by the Last Alliance will be undone. So finding it and getting it is very high up on Sauron's to-do list. Unfortunately though, for him, it's entirely lost right now, and it'll stay that way for quite some time. The second thing that Sauron wants is power in general. He wants dominion over all of Middle-earth so that he can shape it into what he perceives of as perfection. And thirdly, I think he wants something quite personal. Vengeance. It wasn't just anyone who cut the ring from his finger. It was Isildur, the king of Gondor, the heir of Elendil, who would himself go on to become the High King of all Dúnedain in both the North Kingdom of Arinor and in the South Kingdom of Gondor. Destroying any and all heirs of Isildur, aka heirs of Elendil, is both strategically necessary for Sauron's ultimate win, but also highly desirable in his personal pursuit of retribution. The elves of the Third Age are diminishing and departing, but the Dúnedain are the ones taking their place. They're the ones with their hands on the wheel of this new age. And for Sauron, that is unacceptable. However, it's not until 1,000 years into the Third Age that we can finally say something concrete about what exactly Sauron was getting up to. For it was 1,000 years into the Third Age that 2 very interesting things happened. Firstly, it was around this time that Sauron regained his ability to take a physical form. And secondly, not coincidentally I think, it was also at this time that the wizards, the Istari, first showed up in Middle-earth to guide the free peoples in their resistance of Sauron. And it's a good thing they did, because only 50 years later, the men and the elves living in Greenwood the Great noticed that something evil was growing in their forest, a shadow with no name. Towards the south of that great wood stands a long-abandoned elvish stronghold upon a hill called Amon Lunk. This stronghold was actually built and originally occupied by Legolas's grandfather, a king called Orophair. But by the year 1050 of the Third Age, Orofair's son Thranduil had moved his people all the way from the south up to the north of the Greenwood. And so the shadow descended upon Amon Lunk. Within 50 years of regaining physical form, Sauron left the east and he entered that abandoned elvish stronghold. And very soon after that, Amon Lunk took a new name, the Hill of Sorcery, or in Elvish, Dol Guldur. No one in the Greenwood knew what was going on in Dol Guldur, but they soon knew enough to fear it. Over the years, rumours grew of a mysterious new enemy, whom the woodsman called the Necromancer. We don't know what Sauron did to earn that title. I know necromancy is quite a common thing in modern fantasy, but like raising the dead and controlling armies of zombies, that's not a thing in Middle-earth. It's not even how death works in Tolkien's writings. So I would suggest necromancer is simply a translation of the word used by the uneducated woodman to describe the mysterious evil sorcerer whom they know next to nothing about. I wouldn't take it too literally. Anyway, as time passed, Greenwood the Great grew sick. Its people grew afraid, and as a result, it began to take a new name: Mirkwood. And this is not the first time in Middle-earth's history that Sauron stealthily came to a big old forest, dwelt there in secret, and subsequently spread an evil shadow of nightshade over it. In the First Age, so like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years earlier, that's exactly what he did to the highland forest of Dorthonion. After being defeated by Luthien Tinuviel and her epic dog friend Huan the Wolfhound, check out my playlist on Beren and Luthien to get that full story, Sauron took the form of a vampire, and he fled to Dorthonion, which later became known as Tower Nufuin, the forest under Nightshade. Vampire Sauron filled that forest with horrors, and he spent the entire rest of the First Age dwelling in his dark and dreadful domain beneath those branches. That's not necessarily relevant to Sauron in the Third Age, but it is an interesting parallel, I think. Sauron has done all of this before. Anyway, within 50 years of his descending upon Dol Guldur, the Council of the Wise became aware of Mirkwood's growing evil. But no one suspected that this necromancer was the Dark Lord of the Second Age, the great enemy, the Lord of the Rings. Instead, they theorized that this shadow upon Dol Guldur was one of his minions who'd finally returned from hiding, probably one of the Nazgul. Now, we know the Wise were wrong about that, but they had good reason to believe it, for shortly after the darkening of Mirkwood, there came irrefutable proof that the Nine had returned. Sauron's deadliest servants were back, and one of them in particular was about to define the next 1,000 years of the Third Age. While Sauron was secretly biding his time in Dol Guldur, he sent his mightiest captain into the northwest of Middle-earth, into a frozen land of iron called Angmar. And there he became known as the Witch King. In the centuries that followed Sauron's return from the east, evil things began to multiply again. They were heralded by the Nazgul, but before long, orcs were once more infesting the Misty Mountains. Evil men were growing bold in the north, and trolls made war upon the wild. We can speculate that there may even have been dragons stirring at this time. But Sauron kept himself hidden. He worked his malice through his servants and through even subtler means. In the land of Angmar, the Witch King took up residence in a red fortress called Carn Dûm, and there he made war upon the Dúnedain of the north, the men of Arnor, the heirs of Isildur. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the Witch King's War, A, because I've already talked about it in previous videos, and B, because if I do, we're going to take a massive tangent from the story of the Necromancer. But what I will say is that the Witch King did Sauron's work for him incredibly effectively. He manipulated the major divisions among the Dúnedain, and he conquered the northern realm of Elendil and Isildur piece by piece. Now, as you know, he did ultimately fail to wipe out the line of kings. The heirs of Isildur did endure as chieftains among the Homeless Rangers all the way down to Chieftain Aragorn, but the North Kingdom was wiped out. And only 76 years after Arnor's downfall, the Witch King brought ruin to the southern kingdom of the Dúnedain too, to Gondor. However, in Gondor, the Dúnedain's disaster was the other way around. In the south, the kingdom survived, but thanks to the Lord of the Nazgul, the line of kings went extinct. Without even leaving Dol Guldur, Sauron brought utter ruin, though, as we know, not quite total ruin, to the kingdoms of the Dúnedain that messed him up so badly in the War of the Last Alliance. By the year 2000 of the Third Age, Isildur's ancient city of Minas Ithil had been conquered and corrupted into Minas Morgul, and the Palantir that he'd brought all the way from Númenor fell into the possession of the Necromancer's servants. However, ringwraiths, orcs, and other evil things weren't Sauron's only weapons in the Third Age, and arguably his most devastating attack didn't involve any soldiers at all. He killed untold numbers of innocent people, devastated vast swathes of land, and depopulated entire regions with the deadliest weapon of all: sickness. Between the years 1635 and 1637, so right in the middle of the Witch King's war with Arnor, dark winds carried a great plague from the eastern lands of Rhûn into the westlands of Middle-earth, and in the years that followed, hundreds of thousands died. The Northmen, that's ancestors of the Rohirrim and the Men of Dale, were some of the worst affected, and so too were the woodmen living within the shadow of Dol Guldur. But in Gondor, things were terrible too. Northern Gondor, called Calenardhon, was pretty much entirely abandoned. Osgiliath suffered enormous casualties. It soon ceased to be Gondor's capital city. The fortresses guarding Mordor were all forsaken. Gondor's king and all his children died, and even the white tree of Gondor grew sick and withered and perished. After breaking the might of Gondor, the Great Plague moved northward, gaining strength and killing as it went. Much of Eriador was left forever desolate. Cardolan and Minhiriath lost pretty much all of their populace, and the fortified town of Tharbad also ceased to exist. Even hobbits in the Shire suffered greatly from Sauron's plague, and so too did Sauron's allies in the east. But it made no difference to the Necromancer. He was exceptionally good at waiting. For the next 200 years, pretty much everyone in Middle-earth was primarily concerned with recovering and rebuilding and regaining their fortitude. And even 1,000 years later, huge portions of Middle-earth were still entirely empty of people. It doesn't get talked about as much as the Wars of Gondor or the rise of the Witch King, but Middle-earth's Great Plague was one of the worst things that happened in the Third Age. However, from Sauron's perspective, it was also a bit of a double-edged sword. Following the Great Plague and the fall of Arnor, and the death of Gondor's last king, and the awakening of the Balrog under Moria, the power of Dol Guldur was so great, people were really starting now to pay attention. And among those people was Gandalf. In the year 2060, which is 10 years after Gondor's line of kings went extinct and the rule of stewards began, it became clear to the wise that the Necromancer of Dol Guldur was, in fact, even scarier than a Nazgul. So, in the year 2063, Gandalf travelled to Mirkwood and he ventured alone into Dol Guldur to see what the trouble is. But Sauron wasn't yet ready to let the cat out of the bag, so when Gandalf came, the Necromancer fled, returning to the eastern lands of Rhûn, and he stayed in the east for the next 400 years. Those 4 centuries after Sauron departed Dol Guldur and Mirkwood was freed of the Necromancer are known as the Watchful Peace. For the free people of Western Middle-earth, there was a relative reprieve during this time, and although the Nazgûl were still very much around, they remained quiet in Minas Morgul, preparing for their master's return. The shadow in Mirkwood shortened a little bit, and for the woodmen of the region, this was very good news. For the Easterlings of Rhûn, Sauron's return was quite the opposite. While the people of the West were watching their peace, the people of the East were once again finding themselves under the Dark Lord's dominion. In the lands east of the Sea of Rhûn, so beyond the edges of the map, Sauron corrupted new war bands of Easterlings to his dark cause, and for 400 years, he left the West alone, but he made the far East considerably worse. Until, eventually, he came back. The Watchful Peace ended, and the Necromancer returned to Dol Guldur even more powerful than he'd been when Gandalf came looking for answers. And he did not return alone. Out of the east, Sauron brought a great confederation of evil men who became known to the men of Gondor as the Balcoth. And under Sauron's direction, the Balcoth allied themselves with orcs, and they made war upon the Northmen, who lived between Mirkwood and the River Running, the River Kelduin, and they also caused enormous problems for the Dunedain of Gondor. But that's not all. 15 years after the Necromancer returned to Dol Guldur and the Watchful Peace ended, the first ever Uruk-hai appeared in the annals of Middle-earth's history. They marched out of Mordor and they conquered the Gondorian land of Ithilien, the land of Isildur. After that, they marched on Gondor's former capital, Osgiliath, and they destroyed it. They broke the great stone bridge that united East Osgiliath with West Osgiliath, and they are the reason why this ancient city is nothing but an empty ruin at the time of the Lord of the Rings. I mean, Gondor's civil war didn't help, nor did the plague, but from this point onward, the borders of Gondor are never going to be safe again until the destruction of the One Ring in 544 years' time. But Gondor wasn't even the only place to suffer Sauron's retribution following his return to Dol Guldur. 5 years after the first Uruk-hai appeared on the scene, the Necromancer sent a great many orcs up into the Misty Mountains to block the passages between Eriador and Rovanion, between Middle-earth's west and east. Some of these orcs might have become the future inhabitants of Goblin Town, who we meet in The Hobbit. Some might have joined the armies of Azog and fought in the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, but we know that a lot of them were ordered to occupy Moria. Thanks to the Balrog, Moria has been empty of dwarves for 499 years, but it's at this time that a great number of orcs, Uruk-hai, and trolls started to organize in the ruins of Khazad-dûm. It was the Necromancer who turned Moria into an orc stronghold. But you might be wondering, why now? What happened around the same time Sauron returned from Dol Guldur that led to such an immediate breaking of the 400-year-long Watchful Peace? Well, the answer to that involves a sharp-eyed hobbit who went fishing one day. His name was Deagle. He took a boat out in the Gladden Fields with his friend Smeagol, and while trying to catch an enormous fish, he was pulled into the water. Moments later, he came out sputtering, with weeds in his hair and in his hand a mysterious golden ring. Now, as you all know, this did not end well for Deagol, and it didn't really end well for Smeagol either. But in the tale of the Necromancer, this is a crucial turning point. The ruling ring that Isildur cut from Sauron's finger 2,463 years ago has now been found. It is carried by Smeagol down to the roots of the Misty Mountains, and there it consumes him. I really don't think it's a coincidence that the Watchful Peace ended only 3 years before the One Ring was found. It's also not a coincidence that in the same year it is found, the wisest of the elves, along with Gandalf, Saruman, and Radagast, meet for the first time to establish the Third Age's White Council. From this point onward, the Third Age gets kicked into overdrive. In the years that follow, orcs of the Misty Mountain poison and torture the wife of Lord Elrond, the Lady Celebrian, to such an extent that she can no longer bear to remain in Middle-earth. Arwen and her twin brothers lose their mother. Not long after that, dragons return to the Grey Mountains and make devastating war upon the dwarves. Evil forces invade Eriador, and there's even a battle between orcs and hobbits within the borders of the Shire. And 22 years after that, after Bull Rora Took knocked the head of an orc chieftain called Golfimbul with his club and sent it flying through the air and down a rabbit hole, thereby inadvertently inventing the game of golf, a considerably more dramatic catastrophe descended upon the men of Dale and the dwarves of Erebor. Their homes were destroyed by the dragon fire of Smaug. And not long after that, the War of the Dwarves and Orcs began when the Orc chief Azog murdered the Dwarf King Thror, and it ended in the Battle of Azanulbizar when Thror's great-nephew, Dain Ironfoot, cut the head from Azog's body. And even though Thror's son, the new Dwarf King, Thrain, was victorious in this war, as is so often the case, the greater victory went to the Necromancer. 46 years after the Battle of Azanulbizar, King Thrain, son of Thror, made the fateful decision to enter Mirkwood. He strayed far too close to Dol Guldur, and then, he disappeared. And the reason this is significant, King Thrain was the bearer of a Ring of Power, the last of the 7 that was unaccounted for. In the dungeons of Dol Guldur, Thrain was tortured, he was mentally broken, and the Necromancer reclaimed another Ring of Power. He now held all of the 9, all of the 7 that hadn't been consumed by dragons, and although he was still no closer to the Elvish 3, he didn't really need them. From Sauron's perspective, there was only one ring that mattered now. And the reason we know all of this is because of Gandalf. 5 years after Thrain was captured and tortured, Gandalf snuck back inside Dol Guldur for the second time. He secretly made his way to the Necromancer's dungeons, and there he met what remained of King Thrain. The dwarf was so diminished he did not even know his own name, but he gave Gandalf a map and a key to the Lonely Mountain, and he gave the wizard just enough information to put 2 and 2 together. So Gandalf went straight to the White Council. He told them what he discovered, and he urged them to attack Dol Guldur right away and expel the Necromancer before his power could grow any further. However, on this matter, Gandalf was overruled by the leader of that council, by Saruman the White. Saruman insisted that the One Ring was lost forever, so they should just wait and watch and bide their time. Very interestingly, it was during this meeting of the White Council that Saruman first became aware of the existence of hobbits. 60 years later, Saruman discovered that servants of the Necromancer were indeed trawling the banks of the Anduin, desperately searching for something, but instead of relaying this information to the rest of the White Council, instead Saruman kept it to himself, and he started searching the lands around the Anduin River too, hoping to find whatever the Necromancer was searching for before anyone else did. Little did either of them know, they were both, of course, searching in the wrong place. Which brings us to the most important year so far. Only 2 years after Saruman discovered Sauron's agent searching the river for a ring, Gandalf went to the Shire searching for a burglar to take part in an adventure. 3 months later, that burglar, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, became the most unlikely creature imaginable to be fumbling about in the dark beneath the misty mountains. And in those caverns he found a magic ring, and the ruling ring found a new bearer. Later that same year, Smaug the dragon was slain. The battle of 5 armies was won, and the White Council finally did what Gandalf urged them to do 91 years ago. They attacked Dol Guldur. We know almost nothing about the specifics of that battle, if there even was a battle, but we do know that Sauron was anticipating it, and when the White Council came for him, he revealed himself to them. The time of the Necromancer was over. The time for secrecy was done. When the wise came for Sauron, Sauron departed Dol Guldur, and he fled to his ancient stronghold in Mordor. The Third Age entered its final act. Shortly after returning to Mordor, Sauron sent 3 of his Nazgûl, including the Witch King and the Witch King's second-in-command, Khamûl the Black Easterling, to reoccupy Dol Guldur and maintain it as a place of dread and evil sorcery in Mirkwood. But Sauron's time there was done. In Mordor, he ordered the rebuilding of his ultimate fortress, Barad-dûr. He built an enormous army of darkness, and 12 years after revealing his true identity, the fires of Mount Doom awoke again. Orodruin erupted, and the Lord of the Rings set in motion his final war. He used Isildur's Palantir, the one that his Nazgûl stole from Minas Ithil / Minas Morgul, and he used it to ensnare the wizard Saruman. 1 year later, Gandalf rode to the Shire because his buddy Bilbo Baggins was having a birthday party. And during his birthday speech, Bilbo vanished. Gandalf began to suspect perhaps Bilbo's invisibility ring was in fact something a bit more sinister. He convinced Bilbo to give it up, and so the ring passed to Bilbo's heir, Frodo Baggins. In the 17 years that followed, Gandalf worked very, very hard to find out all he could about this powerful ring, and he decided the best place to start was with its previous owner, the creature Gollum. With lots of help from good old Aragorn, Gandalf spent years hunting for Gollum, but as we all know, the enemy found him first. In the year 3017 of the Third Age, Gollum snuck into Mordor, and there he was captured. He was brought to Barad-dûr, and he was tortured, potentially by Sauron in person, and in his agony he screamed 2 words, Shire and Baggins. And so the hunt for the ring began. The very next year, Sauron's army assailed Osgiliath, again in what became known as the first conflict of the War of the Ring. And around the same time, he sent orcs into northern Mirkwood to attack Thranduil's realm and to ensure Gollum's escape from the keen eyes of the Wood Elves. This was a coordinated assault. Sauron sent his Nazgûl to lead the attack on Gondor, but their presence there was only a deception, only a disguise for their true purpose. After defeating the defenders of Osgiliath, who were led by 2 brothers, Boromir and Faramir, the Ringwraiths turned north, and they set off on a secret mission to find the Shire, to find Baggins, and to take the treasure that he's carrying. And the rest of that story you definitely already know. Frodo leaves the Shire just before the Ringwraiths find him. He arrives in Bree, where he meets the heir of Isildur, the descendant of the kings of the Dunedain that Sauron failed to destroy. The sword that cut the ring from his finger is reforged. The Fellowship guides the ring-bearer south. The Fellowship breaks, and due to the epic courage of Frodo, the staggering loyalty of Sam, the treachery of Gollum, and the pity of Bilbo and Frodo and Sam, Sauron's ring falls into the fire. The Dark Lord suffers his final defeat, and he is utterly vanquished, maimed forever, and reduced to a mere spirit of malice that gnaws itself in the shadows but cannot ever again grow or take shape. And so a great evil of Middle-earth is finally removed. This may be a bit of a spicy take, but I think Sauron is one of the most interesting characters in all of Tolkien's writings. In the first age, he is but a disciple, a henchman to a much greater evil. In the second age, he is the Lord of the Earth, the King of Kings, the Deceiver who brought ruin to Eregion and Númenor. And in the third age, he is the mysterious Necromancer, a shadow, a secret enemy wielding power behind the scenes and taking millennia to regain mastery of all that he lost when Isildur cut the ring from his finger. In some ways, Third Age Sauron represents kind of the ultimate comeback story, and yet in other ways his is a tale of pride and self-deception and the ultimate fall. He lost it all, then he gained it all back, and then he lost it again. Because he could not believe that when the hands of the wise and mighty falter, perhaps help shall come from the weak. Believing that the heirs of Isildur were a greater threat than a pair of hobbits protecting their friends was the Dark Lord's ultimate mistake. That was the mistake that cost him everything. So, that's it, I guess, for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and if you did enjoy it, be sure to hit like and leave a comment and click the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss any future videos coming soon. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy and Nevair Melanin.